People thought it was a risky decision to leave high school, but the actual risk was very low. The risk would have been to stay because it was guaranteed that I was on the path to burnout. I could see that. My parents could see that. Anyone around me could see that. My guidance counselor could see that. Like, it's not normal for a teenage girl to come home from school every day and sob because she's overwhelmed by her workload. Like, it's not going to get better. When you go to college, you're going to be still stuck in the same path of trying to strive to achieve standards that someone else has set for you. At what point are you going to be able to say, well, these are the things that I care about? This is what success is to me. And I'm not going to keep striving on the assembly line, being told, okay, this is the next step that you have to take.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Madison Adkins. Maddie is a Praxis graduate. She went through the Praxis program back when I was working for Praxis as a coach. And so I've known her for years. And for the past 2.5 years, Maddie has been working with me on the marketing agency that I've been building, doing marketing work, specializing in alternative education programs, but also working with clients in other spaces, other people who we find interesting and whose brands we're excited to amplify. In today's episode, Maddie and I go deep both into her education journey as both a high school and a college dropout, but also into the work that we do with our clients and the approaches that we take to marketing alternative education programs. We talk about some of the biggest mistakes that we see educators make in their marketing approaches. We talk about the distillation process that we take our clients through to help them refine their brand positioning and their messaging and the way that they're describing their offerings to parents. And we talk about some of the best practices that we use for different platforms and the ways that we optimize the way that we're translating people's vision and mission to best serve them on the various platforms that they're using to get their message out into the world. I've wanted to have Maddie on the podcast for a while to talk about some of the work that we do because it's really relevant to the conversations that I have here and hopefully relevant to some of you listeners who are also building innovative projects in schools. Hopefully you find something in this episode useful. I hope you enjoy. Madison Adkins, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
You guys, I am so excited for you to get to meet Maddie and spend the next hour hanging out with us. Maddie is a very important part of my world. Besides running Rebel Educator and building this podcast, I also run a marketing agency that specializes in helping innovative education projects build their brands in the same way that I've built mine with Rebel Educator and the podcast. And I've been doing this since 2022. And when I launched this project, Maddie was the very first person that I hired. This project would not exist without her. She's amazing at what she does. And Maddie and I go even farther back than working together on the agency because Maddie did Praxis in 2020 when I was working for the program as a coach. And so I met her when she was in the early stages of her startup journey and she was working in marketing, and I was very impressed and made a mental note in the back of my head that at some point I was going to need to come up with an excuse to work with her again in some capacity. So I started a whole marketing agency so I could. And so Maddie and I spend a lot of time every week talking to each other. And a lot of what we talk about is the marketing of innovative education programs, the marketing of different schools, of different products. And it seemed kind of crazy to not have her on the podcast because so much of what we talk about is so related to so many of the conversations that we have here and hopefully relevant to a lot of you who are listening, who are maybe building innovative education projects of your own. So what Maddie and I want to do today is talk about the work that we do and the things that we've learned from spending the past 2.5, 3 years building education media brands and building the brands of education programs, starting with my work with Rebel Educator, but then expanding out. We've worked with everything from programs that serve 6 months old to higher education. So we've worked the full spectrum on a whole bunch of different platforms and different approaches. And so we want to distill some of the things that we've learned doing this and hopefully give you a set of actionable insights that can help you with a brand building of the projects that you're working on. We're very big champions of the movement at large. We're very big believers that a rising tide lifts all boats. We want to see everybody crush it with their education marketing. So hopefully today's conversation will be helpful to that end. But before we get into all the specifics, I want to talk a little bit, Maddie, about your story, because you're not just randomly working at an alternative education marketing company because this is, you just happen to know somebody who is building one. This is really personal for you too. You also have an unusual education story. And I want to start by talking about that a little bit because your story is really interesting. How did you become interested in unconventional paths of education?
So I wasn't always that way. I was a very successful student. I had a 4.1 GPA. I had just gotten my PSAT scores back and they were fantastic. And I was taking like 5 AP classes. I had ambitions of going to an Ivy League. And I think it's just because, the praise that you receive when you're doing that feels really, really good. I liked that way that my guidance counselor told me that I was doing a good job when he saw my grades and my course load. I liked bringing home report cards filled with A's. It felt really good. I was in a system that, deemed me as smart because of the things that I was doing. I was playing the game. But at the same time, I was also exhausted and I was very anxious and stressed out. And so was every other student around me. And I really remember at this time, waking up some days and looking out the window and seeing the real world and being like, oh my God, I could cry because I really don't want to go to school, but I had to. And my school was especially interesting because they did not let us go outside at any point during the school day. They wouldn't even let us leave the cafeteria during lunch, even just to go back to our lockers. So I had this stifling energy. I was like, oh my God, I just want a little bit of freedom. And I remember sneaking out a side door and just breathing the air and being these little moments of rebellion. And so I was in a capstone course. It was an AP capstone course, and we were just doing projects on topics, and I was assigned the topic of education, which was kind of a, serendipitous moment. So the more these two sides of me dueled it out in my head, the more I was learning about education system as a whole. Even beyond that project, continued to learn about it and continued to read books like Walking on Water by Derek Jensen, and The Teenage Liberation Handbook by Grace Llewellyn, which just painted a picture of a different path, one where I was not forced to go somewhere I didn't want to go, to regurgitate facts on a test that I would then forget immediately after. So in October of my junior year, right at the height of when this was the most important time, I dropped out of high school. And almost instantaneously, I fell in love with learning again. I had questions about the world, and I finally had the time to go answer them. And I did a lot of really interesting, cool things with my newly available time, and learned so much looking back, in those 2 years than I would have if I had stayed where I was. And everything that I learned led me to getting hired by a nonprofit to work on their messaging. And this is really how I got my start in marketing. I was building the skills, in my juniors and senior years of high school that I still use in my career today. And I did all of this before I was ever going to graduate high school. I mean, I didn't graduate high school. I don't have a diploma, and honestly, I've never needed one. But I still thought, okay, well, maybe all of this was just leading me to still be able to get into college. I mean, I had a lot of really impressive accolades, so I applied to college. But then got there and realized it was actually much the same as high school. Um, so I realized compulsory education just really is not for me. So I dropped out twice and then found Praxis and met Hannah, and the rest is history.
We've talked about your education experience in high school before. I don't think I ever realized that you were in a school that didn't let you go outside and didn't let you leave the cafeteria during lunch hour. That's crazy.
It was crazy. It was all these safety controls on us, but
Well, you were at a huge school, right?
there was 5,000 kids at my school. So
That's nuts.
yeah, it was definitely a perfect storm of events that led me to where I to where I ended up. But, as soon as I left, I knew I had made the right decision. And it's funny that, like, even back then, I knew that a self-directed path was the path for me. And then now being a freelancer, like, that just fits so much more for my lifestyle. Like, being able to set my own schedule. I have friends who, like, work in an office, and I'm like, "You work in an office? And you have to, like, pack a lunch? Like, how do you do that?" Like, and they tell you that you work from 9 to 5. Like, what if you wanna work from 10 to 6? Or, what if you wanna work in the evening? Like, what if you wanna work 24 hours one day? I mean, I don't know. So, it's just surprising to me, that I knew all the way back then that that is the life that I wanna live, and I did it.
How did you convince your parents to let you drop out of high school?
It was like a staircase method. So, like, instead of going straight from dropping out of high school to, like, nothingness, um, I did online school for, like, I think a few weeks. It was not a very long-lived thing because I remember the online school was like, "Just so you know, we're just like a regular school." And I was like, "You're an online school, like, that's the whole point is that you're not like a regular school," but they were like, "We have the same school hours and blah, blah, blah." So I, convinced my parents that when I'm convinced about something and I'm persuasive about it, I can usually get my word across pretty well. And they understood that, like, I was really that, like, the most important thing to them was that I was happy, and they saw that school was really detrimental to my health, my mental health, but also my physical health. Um and they didn't want that either. I mean, it's interesting, like, what all the signs of success, in children, in our it's still a problem, even more so now. We think of them as signs of success, but really, like, they have such disastrous consequences. So I think my parents also had to redefine what is success for their daughter, and I think that they're really happy that they trusted me.
Did you get a lot of pushback from the world at large too? Because that's a bold thing to do. You were doing very well. You were in a school of 5,000 people and you were near the top of it and you were performing super well in your classes. And even though you were really unhappy, you're still getting all of the social validation that you're doing the right thing and you're doing really well in life and what you're doing is impressive and it's valued and it's, people put you on a pedestal because you're the smart kid who's super gifted academically. And that's a really powerful set of reinforcements. I felt I wasn't even in school. I wasn't even inside the system that feeds
Yeah,
into this. And I still felt good about myself when I was, you know, at home being homeschooled, but was doing well academically because
right.
so much of the culture is structured around that being an ultimate good. How did you push back on the, like, just even in your own mind, push back on the pressure that you were feeling to keep going down that path and decide you wanted to step off of it enough that you were willing to try to convince your parents to let you do it when so much of how the world is structured tells you the most valuable thing about you is that you're really good in school?
Yeah. So, this is really interesting because this actually I did receive a lot of pushback. Um, so the funniest example of it was, one of the things I had done when I was a dropout, was I did a lot of public policy work, and that led the work that I did led to me getting noticed, and I was doing a lot of speeches, and one of the biggest speeches I gave, I was on a panel that was moderated by Al Gore. And there was like 2,000 people in attendance, and it was, this really impressive moment for me. And I shared my story. But I also ended my story with the fact that I was like accepted to the University of Oregon and that I was like planning to go there and to continue to study, environmental studies. Um, and I was in the bathroom after the panel, and someone came up to me and she said, I am just so impressed with you. And I was like, thank you. And then she said, but I think you're really gonna regret not having a high school diploma, and I really think you should go back. And I was like, I'm already in, like, I've already accepted to college. Like, what more could you want from me? And I just got off of a panel that you watched, and I'm much younger than you are. Like, I was just so shocked that, like, all of these, like, validations of my success were not enough, and that this person was convinced that I would regret not going back to high school to get my high school diploma. And truth be told, like, people thought it was a risky decision to leave high school, but the actual risk was very low. The risk would have been to stay because it was guaranteed that I was on the path to burnout. I could see that. My parents could see that. Anyone around me could see that. My guidance counselor could see that. Like, it's not normal for a teenage girl to come home from school every day and sob because she's overwhelmed by her workload. Like, it's not going to get better. When you go to college, you're going to be still stuck in the same path of trying to strive to achieve standards that someone else has set for you. At what point are you going to be able to say, well, these are the things that I care about? This is what success is to me. And I'm not going to keep striving on the assembly line, being told, okay, this is the next step that you have to take. Next step is college, next step is mortgage, and you're going to keep striving and striving to achieve goals that you didn't even set for yourself. So I think that was the thing that helped me, like, ignore the people that, like, didn't want their kids to talk to me because they were afraid, like, they would get bad ideas, talking to me, is just, like, there was no real risk, and honestly, it has never harmed me because now no one has ever asked for my diploma. I hope they don't anymore, but no one has ever wanted to know.
I
No employee.
I promise I never will.
I don't have one, so I
Well, you still get to work with me. It's fine.
what skills would I have learned in high school that would be applicable at this exact moment? Like, honestly, like, I learned how to be obedient, and I don't think that that would be super relevant right now. So,
Yeah. Yeah, it requires a lot of courage to be willing to step off the path that's been put in front of you. And we talk about this a lot on the show because, there are so many stories of parents who have kids who are really frustrated, who have to take the initiative and muster the courage to do something other than what they're, quote, supposed to, which is a really scary thing to do. But in some ways, I think it's even scarier when you are the student and even your parents don't see eye to eye with you, and you have to really advocate for, no, I want to make this choice. And even if all of my counsel around me thinks that I'm wrong, I still want to make this choice. And so I really admire that you were able to do that because that's really hard. And clearly it worked out great for you. But also, nobody listening to this show is surprised that that is a thing that is possible, that you can drop out of high school and be
right.
great in life. Okay, so I want to talk, we could keep talking about this forever. And maybe someday you'll come back on the show and we will. But really what I want to talk about today is, the things that we've learned in the work that we do. So you've been marketing alternative education programs for like 2.5 years now, working with me. Obviously, you've been in the trenches in this space for far longer, advocating for your own experience and then going through Praxis, which is, very entrenched also in the alternative education world. So you've been in this space for a while, but you've been boots on the ground, hands in the dirt, working on marketing alternative education projects since 2022. And what I want to do today is just kind of break down both the things that, like, we've learned in working on different projects and trying to market different projects, but also hopefully share some of the, like, best practices and sort of the progression that we recommend people go through when they're starting to ramp up their marketing efforts, to hopefully be helpful for people who are listening to this, who are building projects of their own. So I want to talk a little bit about what we do, and like kind of where some of this knowledge that we have comes from. And then we can get into a lot of the specifics of hopefully, helpful content around here's how to actually build a marketing strategy for an alternative school. So most people who are following this already are familiar with Rebel Educator. A lot of them have been along the ride for a while, watching the brand grow. I started with 0 followers in the spring of 2022, which is also when the agency was getting off the ground. And we now have 140,000 followers on Twitter. It's, become a pretty big internet brand, or like relatively big in the education space anyway, resource hub for parents. And it's been a super fun ride figuring out how to build a social media brand. That was my first stab at building a big social media presence for something. big learning curve. There's a lot you learn along the way in figuring out how to create viral content and build a following. But since then, you and I have worked on a number of other schools and projects, some of whom people may or may not be familiar with from hearing guest appearances from people on the show at different points in time. We'll not confirm or deny. But we've built Instagram accounts to 6 figures in followers. We've worked in everything from like the school network space to the online program space. We've worked in higher education. We've worked on like networks of like micro schools. We've done all sorts of different things in different spaces, and we've built out different strategies for different clients depending on their specific goals, because people are working in different geographic regions. Some people are national, some people are pretty local or centered to a couple different states. Some people are really focused on trying to become one of the sort of quote thought leaders in the education space, and they want to be one of the front runners of the conversations that are happening. They want to be invited to the conferences and on the panels and on the podcast interviews. Other people are much more focused on recruiting students from other channels, but using social media sort of as like a social validation platform, where when parents find their school through another means, but start doing research, looking at different accounts, they can go and see what the student experience is like on a platform like Instagram or Facebook. So we've kind of worked the gamut of both social media marketing, content marketing. We've done like blog post writing for different projects. We've built email lists. Maddie has spent a lot of time in Substack. We've kind of done the full range. And there are a couple of things that we sort of specialize in, and a couple of philosophies that underpin a lot of what we do, which I think are both just important context pieces for the conversation that we're going to have about how we help people develop this, that hopefully will be helpful to you too. But we believe very strongly both that a rising tide lifts all boats in the education movement. Like, it's not just about marketing a school, it's about marketing the philosophy of the education that you want to deliver to a child, which far transcends the individual schools or the individual signups of a program that you're selling. And we also believe very strongly that the world is very hungry for resources on different innovative ways of raising and educating children. And there are big momentum waves in the space that can be ridden to build a lot of traction with a new program. The world is really, really hungry. Parents are really, really hungry for resources besides just the status quo. Teach your kid to read via the whole word method and send them to public school and feed them school lunches and they'll be fine. And so there's a lot of energy in the space that honestly, Maddie, you can speak to this too, however you feel about it, but I feel is really, there's tons of potential. There's so much untapped potential in this space. And we work with people who have really deep philosophies around how they want the world to be and how they think it should be. And the products that they're building, the schools they're building, the programs they're building just happen to be almost a side effect of that philosophy. Like, they're building this thing because they believe this, which makes it really fun to talk about what they're doing because there's so much energy behind it. We don't only work with schools. We work with other types of projects and companies too, but a lot of our niche has sort of accidentally become education because that's where a lot of our network is. And when I say school, when I'm talking about this, you can interchange it for program or product or, whatever disparate thing is being marketed. We kind of use school as a catchphrase because that's been the majority of our clients, but we've worked on all different sorts of things. Maddie, I'm curious. I mean, that's how I would describe what we do and kind of the philosophy underpinning it. But I'm curious how you would describe, just sort of like at a high level, what it is that we do with clients in terms of sort of the approach we take to marketing. Because we're not just like, okay, well, optimize your Google search results and run some ads for you and call it a day. Like we're pretty entrenched in the philosophical side of how people are thinking about the products they're building. I'm curious how you would describe it.
Yeah, we are the, like, philosophical partners alongside, our clients. We want to help, these schools not just, increase, their students or, grow their capital, but also to become thought leaders in the space. And to do that, you need a thought partner alongside you that can help to distill what is interesting about you, to capture what is interesting about you and translate it into the language of social media or Substack or whatever the platform may be. And that's the simple but difficult process that we are able to do for clients. It's marketing is simple. It's not, technical, I mean, and parts of it are, but the parts that are really easy to understand. I mean, anybody can learn SEO. Anybody can learn how to post on Instagram or how to run a Facebook ad. Those are not the difficult parts of marketing. The difficult parts of marketing are the distillation of what makes you interesting and how to speak to other people about that and get them to understand it quickly. So that's, I would say, like, the translation um is what we do best. Like, it's the biggest thing that we do for clients is the translation of what they do into something that is communicable, that people can understand.
Yeah, and not only that people can understand, but that's optimized for the the means by which that information is being distributed. And what I mean by that is, marketing happens in large part on the internet, and it happens in large part through existing platforms. So you're posting on Instagram, you're posting on Twitter, you're posting on LinkedIn, you're writing articles that you're hoping are going to rank high in Google search results. It's like, you're hoping it's the first thing people see when they Google something. And each one of these platforms sort of has a set of rules around how content needs to be structured in order to do well on that platform. If you write, a 5-page essay and post it on Facebook, nobody's going to read it. If you make a, 20-minute video and try to post it on Instagram, no one's going to watch it. There are sort of actual rules of engagement and also best practices of engagement in terms of how you create content for different platforms. So not only are we translating what's interesting, but we're also then framing it in a way, packaging it in a way that's structured for various platforms. We're distilling it and then translating it into the language of the different places on the internet where you want to start getting in front of people. And one of the fun things about what we do is that we're working with a bunch of different clients. So we're running experiments that kind of translate across all of our different client base. So we get to learn a lot about the platforms and stuff and what sorts of formats work well in different places and, what people seem to be hungry for at the moment. And we can run some experiments in that regard. But one of the first things that we do, and I think this is actually pretty actionable for people. One of the very first things we do when we start working with a client is we do what we call like the philosophical interviews. So we'll set up calls with everybody in basically who's like heavily involved in the building of the school or the project. So the leadership team or, the people who are most invested in the curriculum or, the school design or something like that. And again, you can interchange, school with program or product or, whatever it is that you're working on. But we'll set up these interviews and then we'll ask a series of questions to start to tease out the interesting things. Because usually when we're creating a marketing strategy, we think about content pillars. So we're looking for like sort of 5-ish, roughly, really interesting points of view or really interesting positions that we can build a lot of the content around. And this isn't an arbitrary number. There tends to be, usually for any person building an education project, there tends to be a handful of really interesting, really strong positions about things. So we start interviewing our clients, like different people, different stakeholders inside of the company about, like, to start to tease out these things. And so we're asking questions like, why is this the thing that you're building? Like, why are you invested in this? And usually there's some interesting stories that are teased out there. And sometimes there's really good grains of, it's like Maddie, it's like your story where I dropped out of high school because I was so anxious and stressed, and kids should not be anxious and stressed in school. And so I'm building this, software platform that allows them to do their academics without getting super stressed and miserable or something like that. But what are some of because you've conducted a lot of these interviews over the course of the past few years. What are the most important questions in your mind to start to tease out some of these interesting content pillars?
Yeah. So I'd recommend you sit down with your team and you discuss this, because sometimes we haven't put this out. And, like a lot of people might think that they know exactly what the mission that we're all here to do is, but getting it out and having a discussion about it and putting it down on paper is so clarifying. Um, so I think the first question, asking, yeah, why do we exist? Why are we here? How are we different from other offerings in the landscape? Not just from traditional school, but from other alternatives in the space. Why is our curriculum structured the way that it is? Why do we believe in the pedagogy that we do? What type of curriculum do we use and why? What are the mechanics of how things work in our school? How does a student get an education here, and why do we do it this way? Why are we different? Ask yourself, what philosophies you believe in. What is the day-to-day experience of a student at your school? All of these questions can kind of get you to these really interesting answers, like Hannah was pointing out. And they're different from a mission statement. You might have a mission statement for your organization, but a lot of times mission statements are basically just word salad, maybe okay for internal purposes, but you definitely do not want to use your mission statement unless it's a really good one. But most rarely that is not the case. So I would recommend not thinking about it as your mission, but trying to answer the question of, who are we serving? What is their mission? What do parents want that is driving them to your school? And you might need to actually look at testimonials and talk to some parents to know exactly what that is, because your guess might not be what you think. Your guess of what is correct might not actually be what is correct. So this is kind of a fact-finding mission. It's asking yourselves what matters most with your brand, but it's also trying to understand what matters most to your audience about your brand and what drives them to you.
That point about talking to parents about why they're actually customers is really important, because it's really, really, really easy to get this wrong, because you might build a school around an amazing academic curriculum. It's really rigorous, it's really high standards, it's super efficient so kids can work through it without wasting a ton of time. And you might be completely convinced that that is why people are customers of your school, because in your mind, that's the most important thing about what you've built. But then you go talk to your customers and you realize that none of them are saying anything about the curriculum. Or maybe you go and look at the reviews that your customers are reading online. If your school is big enough, Reddit can be a really interesting place to get a pulse on how your student, or how your parents and your students feel about your school, because they're going to be a lot more honest on Reddit than they might be talking to your face. But you could ask, you can go into Reddit and start reading people's reviews and then start asking yourself questions about, what's going on in between the lines. And you might realize that no one's referencing your curriculum at all. They're referencing the community of your school and how safe their kids feel there, and how safe they feel leaving their kids there, and how many great friends their kids have, and how much they like their teachers. And you realize that people are choosing your school because of the community element. And in their minds, the curriculum is much more utilitarian. It just happens to be how the kids are absorbing their academic content. And it happens to be really good, but that's not why they chose your school. And if you didn't do that research, you would be perhaps completely convinced that the thing you're selling is the curriculum. And so all of your marketing would be built around your curriculum, and all of your you're missing your target mark because you're not reaching the people who would really resonate with the community that has been built inside of your school, which is actually the thing that people care about, which is something, this is a conversation that you and I've had many, many times, because this is a thing it's a really easy trap to fall into. And you're so in the weeds of what you're building. You have really strong hypotheses around what's most important, as you should, that's necessary for building something that's going to be great. But it can be hard to step back from that and start to tease out the difference between what you think is important and what your customers actually are think they're buying.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's once you've identified really like who you are and what you're here to do, that is like the majority of the work. That is the hardest part is taking all of that and really understanding, how you're going to be compelling, because on social media you're not going to have a long time to make the case for why parents should entrust their child's education to you. You're going to have like 5 seconds to capture someone's attention, and all of the work that
It's
you're
mostly vibes.
right. I mean, but all of the work you're doing in the stage is setting the ground to be able to capture that attention. When you are given that opportunity, that you're going to make the most of that opportunity. And so you have all of this information that you've gathered, and you take all of this, and the next step is to simplify it and distill it so that it can be translated into the language of different platforms. And then we can talk about maybe like how to choose those platforms, because that's a whole other, can of worms. Um, Hannah, do you want to share thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, before we do, I have one more point that I want to bring back, because you very gently touched on this earlier, the sort of framing of the language not being a mission statement. And I think that's really important. This is something you talk about a lot, where a lot of like, it's very easy to create content that's very company centric,
Right.
and parents don't actually care about that. Can you talk about this for a minute? Because this is really important.
Yes. So mission statements and most marketing from companies tends to be framed in terms of what you want to happen. So you'll say, at our school, this is how things run, and our mission is to revolutionize education. We're going to change the way that kids learn, and that's what we are here to do. Now, that is interesting if you are an employee of the company, but if you're a parent, if you're constantly reading copy and marketing on the website, things that are centered on the company, this is not interesting to you as a parent, because what parents' missions might be is, I want my child to be happy at school. I want my child to succeed. I want my child to have their potential uncapped. I know my child can do more, and school is limiting them or holding them back. Those are the missions that drive a parent to seek out your school. And so, if we frame everything not in terms of our own desires and missions, but in terms of our audience desires and missions, if we center them at the story that we're telling, we make them the hero of the story, and we get to become the guide that brings them along to the rest of the hero's journey. It completely shifts the way that the marketing feels. So instead of trying to market an event, and say, come join us. We want you to come learn about our school. That is your mission for this event. Say you're having an event to bring interested families and help them learn more about you. That is your goal. Don't state that out loud on social media, because a parent's goal might be something completely different. What is a parent's goal? What would drive them to come learn about your school? Come see a place where kids direct their own learning, and let your child have the opportunity to study their interests. Remember that thing that your child was interested in that they never had a chance to do, and then the interest just faded away because they had to focus on things that school required them to? Come here, because here they will have dedicated time in their school day to learn about that. These things are so much more compelling because the mission is centered on what the parent's mission is, what the child's mission is, not what our mission is as a company. So thinking about that switch in almost every piece of marketing that you're going to do, everything that you're going to promote, remember not to center your goals, but to center your audience's goals.
You also talked about the word salad of company mission statement, which is so true. It's so many companies have such generic mission statements, and this is one of the things that we really try to breakthrough in our marketing efforts. Um, like we focus really heavily on organic social media marketing, in part because it really helps kind of break through all of the corporate veneer of we're going to change the world and revolutionize education. And that sounds just so, they're all words that sound really good, but the sum of them means very little. Like, you can't picture what that means. And organic social media marketing can feel really helpful in breaking through that, in part because the things that do well on social media are the things that are less polished. It's the tweets that feel like they were fired off. You know, you pulled out your phone while you're waiting in line for something and you fired off a thought, or an Instagram video that looks like it was shot on your iPhone, or literally was shot on your iPhone, and feels less polished, and like there's less of a filter between the person watching the video and the person who made it. It feels like a direct channel of communication, as opposed to something that went through a corporate marketing department and was approved by a committee. And you know, the word authenticity is so overused in marketing. Everybody's chasing authenticity, and yet no one's actually being authentic at all. But there's a perceived feeling of sincerity and unfilteredness that comes through social media when it's done well, and when it's done in an unpolished way, that tends to do really well, and is something that we emphasize really heavily often in the marketing strategies that we start to build out. But what is it about, like, how would you define the difference between a word salad company statement, like mission statement, and a mission statement that feels like it actually came from the soul of the person who is inspired enough and committed enough to lose sleep at night building this thing because they think it makes the world a better place? And they actually have a really clear-cut hypothesis where, like, if this happens, the world will actually be measurably better. And that is worth losing out on time with my family, time on vacation, time sleeping, time spent doing all of the other things that I love to try to bring into the world. What is the difference between a word salad that all the words sound good, but they mean kind of nothing, and that level of passion and specificity coming through in the messaging?
Yeah, and I think what you just said is really the key, is like specificity, because what is it that you are doing that nobody else can do? And if you can articulate that, that will be a much more interesting mission statement. So like, you look at bland mission statements and you'll see a lot of like innovative technology, building a better tomorrow kind of language that go basically apply to anything. And a lot of schools that we work with have innovative technology, and they are trying to build a better tomorrow. But we can't talk about this in this way, because that demonstrates to me that this school doesn't actually know what they're doing or why they're doing it, or if they do know, they haven't yet articulated it. Because what you should instead ask is, why is the technology that you use at your school so innovative? Is it innovative, or actually is it kind of the simplest method? Like, one of the schools that we work with recognized that it wasn't the fact that they were doing something super futuristic and new. They were actually just returning to old ways that people have been learning for centuries. One-on-one education is, the ways that we've always learned. Someone explaining something to someone else, it's not that complicated. Technology can actually make that possible, though, because a teacher doesn't then have to speak to 30 students. They can kind of work with students one-on-one. Technology enables that. And so really what you're not talking about is innovative technology. You're talking about technology that harkens back to traditions that have existed for centuries, ways that we know children learn best, that are, that go beyond what we see now in schools. That's so much more interesting and exciting for a parent to see, that you are aware of, what you're doing, and that you know what makes it special. Because if you're a parent and you have a child, the most rife decision you're going to make is, where are you going to get your child's education from? What worldviews are you going to instill in them? Because that is essentially what an education is. It is where a child gains their first worldviews. I mean, it's where a child spends half their day. So if you're not homeschooling your kids, you're sending them somewhere and you're entrusting a lot of your child's life to another person. If you can't say anything specific about what you do and why a parent should make that decision, then it's why should a parent trust you with their child's education? So the specificity, what makes you different and why should a parent trust you? These are the deep questions that every parent is going to be wondering. And if your marketing can't answer that, they will engage another brand.
One of the things that we also talk to customers really early on about is how they think about their growth goals, because the approach that you take in communicating all of this varies quite a bit depending on the growth goals that you have, and the sort of intersection between how you want to grow and how platforms can help you is like a really important thing to distill down. So getting this really core mission-driven, distinctive framing is really important, and is one of the very first things that we work with clients to get to. And one of the things we're looking for is we spend a lot of time on social media and on the internet consuming education content. And so we have a pretty clear sense of what is sort of both what the trends are in terms of what people are talking about, but also where the interest lies and where the gaps between what people find interesting and what's being created lie. So we spend a lot of time on social media. I think Maddie and I have both trained our social media algorithms to feed us a lot of education content. My Instagram gives me a lot of like Montessori and micro school content. And we spend a lot of time sort of keeping a finger on the pulse of what's happening, in part because we find it really interesting and we're, spending time talking about this, but also, you can justify your Instagram scrolling for it's work research, Totally have never done that. But one of the things you start to notice is that there's really clear-cut interests that people seem to have. Like there's a huge world on Instagram for Montessori content. And there are huge Montessori accounts, and they get tons of traction. The videos go super viral and they get tons of likes and people love it. Like a video of a child cutting up fruit in the kitchen all by themselves, like a 2-year-old making their own snack, it'll explode because people find it surprising. They find it aspirational. They find it's cute. And so it's entertaining and interesting in multiple different verticals, which makes it go viral. But there's tons of Montessori content that gets tons of traction. So there's a clear indicator both that if you're building a Montessori Instagram account, there's a lot of momentum for you to ride. And there's a pretty clear-cut framework around what sorts of content get traction that you can learn from. So you don't have to start from scratch figuring out what an audience will and won't respond to. But then you also might observe when the algorithm starts feeding you, it sees that you like some of these videos and it starts sending you more because it's trying to be helpful and keep you on the platform. You might notice that you're not getting any micro school videos and you go, wait a second, there's tons of parenting content, there's tons of Montessori content, but there's no like huge account that's the front runner of the micro school movement. But the micro school movement is interesting for a lot of the same reasons that Montessori is. Maybe there's a gap here in what people are being exposed to that they actually would find really interesting if they knew it existed. And so one of the things we're doing is constantly looking for gaps in the market in the marketing market, where we know there are interesting things that are being built that people don't know about yet, that haven't gotten traction in terms of sort of the public collective psyche and knowledge base around what is happening in the world. So we're keeping a pulse on that. And then when we're talking to people and they're telling us about their philosophy and their story and why they started this company and what the day-to-day experience is like and what it's like for a student being there and kind of their vision of how they hope, like what their success metric is of a student that goes out into the world as an adult after having gone through their program. How do you know your program did a good job? Like, what is the ideal version of a student going out into the world? What are the markers that you educated them well in the way that you hoped and intended to do? And as we're asking these questions, one of the things we're looking for is overlap between what people are saying and what we know based on how much content is getting traction, what we know parents are interested in, but also what we know, like where there might be gaps where it's like, oh, you're doing this interesting thing that's related to kids making their own snack in the kitchen. Maybe you have kids, um, I don't know, like taking care of, like you're running a micro school and you check books out of the public library and you have a very small child who's in charge of the library, you know, like keeping track of all the library books and everything and organizing everything and like doing the library run, and it's super cute. Or maybe you have kids who are also really young who are building robots or something, and it's sort of the same. It feels thematically similar to a kid cutting up a snack where it's a child doing something that you would think they're too young to do, taking responsibility. It's going to be inspirational for parents. It's probably also cute. Again, it's like adorable content to watch on Instagram. We're watching for things like that where we notice a relationship between things that we know people already are interested in and what you're doing. And we're kind of distilling down some of what we think makes sense to focus on based around that. So one of the really actionable things that's really helpful for people to do if they're building a school is taking time to get a feel for the pulse of what's happening in the broader education conversation, because it'll start to give you insights both into what other people find interesting that you can emphasize about what you're doing, but also, you know, maybe will help you find gaps in the conversation that you can jump in on and add your own expertise. But one of the things we do when we're onboarding clients is we talk to them about their goals. And Maddie, maybe this is something that you can shed some light on too. Like, I would summarize it as basically we're looking for the sort of sweet spot between how a company is trying to grow or how a school is trying to grow. Like, are you trying to grow at a national level? Or are you trying to grow super locally? And sort of their own perceived goals for their brand. So the sort of like enrollment plus brand, like, because you might be super local, but you're trying to be like a contributor to the conversation about education on a national level. And so having a huge brand makes a lot of sense. Or you might be super local and just want the social validation of people find your school through super targeted Google ads because you're only enrolling in, you know, Southern Georgia or something. But when parents Google you, you want them to be able to go to your Instagram and find lots of content around what a day in this life of the school is like, or for an investor to be able to go on Twitter and read about how you're thinking through building this company. So we're kind of looking for the sweet spot between the more aggressive side of the growth goals, but also the like realistic enrollment targets and growth of the organization targets. Maddie, how do you think about this? Because this is a conversation we usually have pretty early on with people as we're developing a strategy.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't know what your goals are, then it's really hard to build a strategy after that. So figuring out, you know, if you want to grow very quickly, then you're probably going to prioritize viral content, which means that you're probably going to speak more generally about your brand, your philosophy, and less specifically about your school. And you're not going to use marketing language just like, you know, come enroll at our we have availability, you know, in our enrollments, come enroll. You're going to be talking about, you know, here's something really interesting that you can do with your kid at home. Like these things aren't exactly like a one-to-one, you know, not someone's not going to immediately watch that how-to video and then immediately enroll. I mean, they might. But the goal is that you're building thought leadership because these are the things that allow you to go viral. And that's because that is your goal. You know that you want to build thought leadership in the space. So you're going to prioritize content that enables you to reach a larger audience, knowing that some small percentage of them will eventually convert into students. But if your goal is just to get students and you don't care about the thought leadership aspect of it, then you would create more specific content that's just about your school. Or perhaps you would then focus, like Hannah was saying, on search engine optimization, you know, trying to capture the existing traffic that's already coming people are already looking for a micro school in their area, well, you wanna make sure that your website pops up first for those people in that area. And so then whatever your goals are, this is where we kind of then determine a strategy. This is where we decide what platforms we're going to post on, how often we're going to post, what kind of content we're going to post. So if you want to go viral, Instagram Reels is one of the best ways to do that right now. Creating small short form videos that are designed to go viral and doing everything that you can to figure out what goes viral. That's your strategy. And you're going to post daily because you want to give yourself as many data points as possible to figure out what is going to make you go viral. But if your strategy is something different, you might be posting on a completely different platform. Maybe your goal is actually to grow your talent network. So you're going to focus your energy on LinkedIn, because that's where you know that most of the candidates that you want to find are going to be hanging out. And so you want to capture that interest there. And you're going to spend less time worrying about your Instagram content because maybe you don't really care about engaging parents. Maybe you just want to find really great teachers. So then think about how your goals will shape the strategy that you use. That's what leads you then to figuring out what platforms, what cadence, and what kind of content you'll post.
Yeah, and the way I would break down platforms just really quickly, Twitter is for thought leadership. It's where you go if you want to be sort of an expert in the space among other experts in other spaces. Instagram is where you reach parents. It's where you have, like Maddie said, probably the most capacity for viral traction. You're going to reach lots of millennials and Gen Zs, especially. TikTok is really good if you're trying to reach a young audience. A lot of the young audience is also on Instagram. But if you really want to get with, especially, if you're targeting high schoolers for something, TikTok's a great platform for that. LinkedIn, like Maddie said, is great for professional growth. Substack is really good for capturing an audience and, again, sort of building thought leadership. Long form content on Substack is perceived to be like a higher echelon of written content than something like, a MailChimp email. It just is perceived as being a little more academic and thoughtful. And it's a great place to, you don't own the audiences that you have on social media. You can get your account, you can be locked out of your account tomorrow and lose your whole audience. Email is where you go to really own your audience. SEO is what you optimize if you're trying to get to the top of Google search results. Obviously, you can run ads on any platform, and, in ads versus organic content, in large part, we've found that the messaging stays relatively the same. The things that do well in an ad that also tend to do well in an organic post. It's just the strategy of how you're distributing it that differs. And, we kind of think about that in terms of like short term versus long term goals. Are you trying to land a client, or sorry, land a customer as a student imminently? Are you in a really big hurry to enroll for next year? Or are you a little more focused on building out your pipeline for the next 3 to 5 years? And that's kind of how you think about splitting resources between things like ads versus organic growth. How do you think about, because it's really hard to take something that's lived in your head probably for years, and it's this whole fully fleshed world, the school you're building or the product you're building, and the way you're thinking about it, and the way you've, all of the philosophy that goes into it and the outcomes that you perceive. How do you think about translating that into short form content? What are some of the biggest rules in your mind for creating content that's actually going to do well on a platform, or like some of the biggest principles to keep in mind?
Okay, so one of them is that you should try to think shorter, more concise, take less time to say what you want to say. That is like a good general rule of thumb because, like you said, you have so much to say about this topic. The best thing that you can do is just like cut it down. And that applies to every platform. Substack, use smaller paragraphs so it's more scannable. Instagram, especially, use a 1-line caption on a 7-second video, and you will do much better than having, 10 lines of captions that play out over a 30-second video. The odds are that someone is going to stick around for that long are pretty low. If they do, I mean, they're probably a super fan, and that's really fantastic. But if we really want to capture a lot of interested people, we're going to need to be able to be concise and be really curiosity inducing and really easy to understand. and not take too long to get to our point. So the other thing is like a lot of times when we think about content on social media, we kind of bury the lead. We think, okay, I'm going to lead up to saying something super interesting at the end. It's like if we think that the interesting thing we want to say is kids should be able to drive their own education, we're going to like say, you know what, in traditional schools, who drives the education? It's not the kids. And then finally, after making several really, really good points and arguments, at the very end, we would then state our aim. Kids should drive their own education. On social media, you have to flip it. You have to put the lead out front. You say, kids should drive their own education. And then you could say, point down to the caption to learn why, if you're interested. And I would say that is not even a good example of something edgy enough to say on social media. So this is the other thing, is that controversy is actually really important. Polarization is really important on social media. A lot of people are afraid of saying something that's going to make people angry at them. This is a concern, of course. You do not want to go making enemies on social media, but the best thing that you can do for your growth is to say something that some people agree with really strongly and some people disagree with very strongly. So if there are people that are angry about what you have said, arguing in the comments with people who are very happy with what you have said, this is the best driver for engagement. Social media platforms cannot tell the difference between negative engagement and positive engagement. They see engagement as the same. So if you are getting thousands of comments because people are starting arguments in the comment section saying, yes, education should be self-paced, and some people are saying, no, it shouldn't, or yes, kids should be able to go to any school that they want, school choice should exist, or no, we should support public schools. These arguments will happen in the comments section, and all of those comments will like add to this tally that you have underneath your video, and social media will see that this is a video that is getting people to stay on the platform and to engage. So they're going to reward that video by making it do better in the algorithm. So this is why you shouldn't be afraid of saying controversial statements that put people on one side or the other. This is also a good way that you identify the people that are going to be fans of you. If they say something that is controversial and they see that you have made this taken a stand, they're going to be more likely to follow you because they know that you're willing to say the things that they want their education to say. So don't be afraid of being controversial. Obviously, don't go try and make enemies, but say things that make people take a stand. Engagement is the metric. So you want people to comment on what you're saying. You want people to disagree with you. You want people to have a reaction to what you're saying. If you're saying something that's really bland, like, yeah, no one's going to get mad at it, but also no one's probably going to notice it at all. You have to say something that is edgy, that is compelling, that is strongly worded and is concise, that gets someone's attention within 5 seconds or less. And if you can do all of that, you have the potential to go viral.
How do you think about the visual quality of content? Because it's really common for people to want to invest in really high quality video footage and photos, and that's not always the thing that does best on social media. How do you think about where it makes sense to invest in quality content versus where it makes sense to deliberately be using lower quality visual content? And by lower quality, I mean like the actual, resolution of the video and the actual quality of the camera. I don't mean, posting about things that aren't aesthetically pleasing, because the aesthetics are important.
Correct. Yes. So the aesthetics are important no matter what sort of camera you're using. So I'd say the rule is aspirational imagery tends to do very well. But when you want to go viral, the best way is to shoot it through an iPhone. So footage that is shot on a camera that is a professional camera, you can just immediately tell. And a lot of times you immediately scroll past it because you know it's an ad. Footage that is shot on an iPhone is just more like the content that people are seeing. It matches with the aesthetics that people are already witnessing on their feed. So it doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. And it also, like Hannah had touched on earlier, points to this authenticity. It feels more natural. That said, like, use your iPhone to its best capability. iPhones can capture some really high quality content, and they can also capture some really grainy, ugly videos. So obviously your imagery should still be beautiful, but I think it should still be authentic. And then the exception is podcasts and presentations. If you are a speaker, you're speaking to an audience or if you're on a podcast, this is situations where actually professional footage seems to do better because it seems to convey an air of professionalism. And so these are the situations where you might want to use more professional footage. This is all just like rules of thumb based on things that we have experienced directly in the algorithm. Like we have shot amazing, beautiful professional footage. It just has not had done as well as the iPhone footage that we have used. So always test all of this and see what works best for your audience. These are rules of thumb that worked best for us.
What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see people making when you go in and you start digging through a company's marketing or something, crops up on your feed because you are really plugged into what's happening in the education world? What are some of the biggest, most common things that you see people consistently getting wrong?
I would say having inconsistency with your fonts, that is like a super easy switch to make. Like pick a font, don't choose a crazy one. Pick one of the ones that you constantly see people use. Don't go crazy with your colors. Keep it simple because you want people to notice the point that you're making and not the font that you're using. So don't use any of the handwritten fonts. Don't use any of the script or curly fonts. Don't use any of the fancy effects like transitions. Don't use filters. Like just have simple footage and a simple message. That's what's gonna get people to take you seriously on social media. Um, the other biggest mistake is taking too long to make your point or not really trying to make a point at all. Every piece of content that you're putting out should have a clear aim, and you should state your aim confidently and clearly. This is especially true in headlines for email. Like, that is the most important sentence that you're gonna write in the entire email, so spend, like, most of your time thinking about the headline and figure out what it is that your audience responds to, whether it is confidence or an imperative saying someone should do this thing. All of these things are known to work really well and experiment with that. And then that is the maybe the third biggest mistake is not tracking your analytics. So it's not helpful to week over week say, we grew this many followers and just like keep patting yourself on the back, being like, we grew followers, yay, we're growing. What you want to do is you want to get a little bit more granular and ask yourself, okay, what performs the best this week? What is the best performing video that we have of all time? What are the common factors between the things that perform well? Maybe it's that people really like the like super sunny footage that we have. It's really beautiful. Okay. Well, then let's go see if that's true and let's run a video where everything about it is kind of meh, but it's gorgeously, beautifully shot. And if that video does well, okay, well then we've hit on something that is true. We know that this is the case that all of our footage now should be shot beautifully. Okay, well, what else might it be if that's not the case? Maybe it's the way that the words were phrased. Maybe it's, the topic of the video, maybe we're talking about a specific topic that gets people really riled up. And continue to try to figure out what works. You're going to keep experimenting, but you need to also be looking back at what you have done and figuring out what it was that made the things that did well do very well.
We could keep talking for a very long time about specifics, but we have a client meeting that we have to get to in a little bit, so I don't want to keep you here too long. One more question, which is what has been the most surprising thing that you've learned about education marketing in over the past couple of years? Is it like, is there anything that stands out in terms of something that feels almost paradoxical that it does well or that it consistently does do well? Does anything stand out to you?
I think the most surprising thing is really this idea of controversy. Because what is surprising to me is that even a post that is perceived very negatively, like you think you failed because people in the comments are saying, this is just like the worst take I've ever heard. Even those do not harm the account's growth. Like I have seen posts that kind of bombed and we still grew massively. Like we grew tons of followers, we had tons of engagement. And it really just made me realize that being afraid to say something strongly is like kind of the biggest barrier, I think, for some accounts. Some brands don't want to say the thing that they're afraid people will hate them for. But, you know, some of the best posts on some of our clients' accounts are ones that received some negative reactions, but the fact is like the people that are in the comments that are the loudest, like don't represent the majority. And Instagram is going to continue to reward you for your content regardless. So you don't need to be afraid of making those mistakes. You can learn from them and you can say, okay, like maybe this isn't our audience, or maybe our audience doesn't resonate with this message. That's great information, but you should not be afraid of that happening because it can actually only help you. So it's counterintuitive and interesting, and just a way about social media that I don't think I realized that that's how it works, but it definitely does. What about you?
Oh, wow. Okay. I honestly think the most surprising thing to me has been you can have a take or create a post that does really well and people find it super valuable, and you can repost almost the exact same thing, like the exact same take, maybe even the exact same creative 3 months later, and people will react in the exact same way, like you've told them something new all over again. And it really reinforces the fact that things resonate for them, but they're not retaining everything that they're consuming. People, especially on social media, this is true for every platform, but especially social media, people are scrolling, they're trying to dissociate or disconnect often. They're like not in their super active, using their cognitive capacity sort of state of mind. They're doing it as downtime in between things. And so you'll share something and it really resonates, but it's not going to stick as whoa, this is fundamentally changing my life philosophy. Sometimes it does. Once in a while, there's a piece of content that you see or read, and it actually does change your behavior because it's really aspirational. But most of the time, it really resonates, but it doesn't stick. And so you have to reinforce again and again the things that you're trying to get across, which is why we emphasize the content pillars. Like, choose a few things that are really core to your message and then say them again and again and again in different ways and show it from different angles. And you're showing these little 10-second snippets of this broader philosophy. But over time, as people are following you, they'll piece the whole philosophy together. Like, it's a slow process of allowing people to get to know your vision and your mission in the same way it's a slow process of getting to know another human that you've met and learning all the different facets and pieces of them over time. It's fascinating to me how many people think it's an original take that you've shared for the very first time. You've never talked about it before when you've shared the same thing like 5 times in the past. And it just really reinforces that you can be redundant, and it's good to be redundant. When you find something that works, double down on it. You don't have to go, wow, that was a really great hit. I hope I can come up with something else this good someday again. You can post the same thing multiple times or change subtle things. Like you post a reel on Instagram and it has the exact same copy but maybe a slightly different video or something. That consistently surprises me, because every time I'm sure people are going to start going, I've heard this before, but they never do. Maddie, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.